Once upon a time, in the year 161, this gentleman, Marcus Aurelius, became emperor of the Roman Empire. And Marcus was a Stoic, and the Roman religion had lots of gods and goddesses and was rather complex, but it gave no guidance to how a person might live their life, what was right, what was wrong, how you should act. And so the Romans adopted the various Greek philosophies as somewhat of a substitute for what we think of as religion. And Marcus created 4 endowed professorships. So as far as we know, these are the earliest ones. Now, Marcus intended for these to last forever. And the fact that Marcus was known as the last of the 5 good emperors of Rome might give us a clue to what happened. So we know a little bit about the education system in Rome, and one thing we do know is they didn't use exams, but I thought this cartoon would be suitable. But they didn't have any universities, so the professors would appear in amphitheaters or in rooms wherever they could, and they held their classes. And because philosophy was more of a thing for discourse and debate rather than exams, that's the way they went. Now, this gentleman is the son of Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, and he was one of the worst emperors of Rome. And the money that Marcus had set aside for these professorships, Commodus is a wannabe gladiator, and he spent his time killing animals and people down in the arena instead of fulfilling his job as the administrative head of the Roman Empire. And eventually, some of his colleagues, his people there, that decided that he was doing such a bad job, they wanted another emperor. They had him assassinated. So now we jump forward about 1,000 years to the year 1249, and in that year, William of Durham died, and he had seen the university in Paris, and he had thought, well, it would be nice if England had a university too. And so he left enough money to start a group of scholars in Oxford, and the money that he was left was supposed to be enough for 8 to 12 scholars at one time. And unfortunately, although in Marcus's case, the money disappeared because the next emperor didn't spend it on something else. In England, they had rules and they had a good system for doing estates and that sort of thing. But the problem there was you have to know who your trustees are and what they're going to do with the money. And so in an endowment, you have to invest the money, and then the earnings on the principal are what support the professorship. So right off the bat, the first trustees took the money and gave it to some politically connected people who thought they could double the money overnight, and they ended up with half the money. So William only got to have 4 scholars for his money. Now, they do remember William of Durham at the university in Oxford because he became the name of their club for people who donate their estates, like we have the Landon Society here in Michigan State. Now, this also been born in 1249 was Lady Margaret Beaufort, and she had an interesting life in that she was more or less sold off by her father to a duke to be married when she was 12 years old. And the duke, of course, one of the disadvantages of being a duke, you have to go out and put on your armor and go fight in the wars. And so her husband was killed in the first 6 months of her marriage, but she was pregnant. So she had her first son at 13, and he was Henry. The son was sent off to live with the brother of the duke who was killed, and their family home was called Tai Dwr, which in Welsh meant house of steel. And the word Tudor came to influence English history for some time. So Margaret then fortunately married an older gentleman who didn't have to go off to the wars, but he was very rich. And she outlasted him and got the money. And she married another one and outlasted him and got the money. So by the time she got to her fourth husband, she was the richest woman in England. So she had also all this time been working, trying to get her son Henry into the royal succession line. Well, it didn't quite work out that it was royal succession, but Henry led the army that defeated Richard III, who was just last year, or year before last, found under a parking garage in Leicester. So that was a current event. But Lady Margaret tried to use her fortune in ways that were good. And her son, this is Henry VII, and he was one of the worst kings of England. And some think that Lady Margaret was especially drawn to philanthropy because her son was so greedy and nasty a ruler. So she started orphanages and hospitals and fed the poor and did all sorts of things. She was quite interested in religion, and this is John Fisher. And John was a Catholic priest who'd earned a advanced degree at Cambridge, and he was a fellow at University of Cambridge, and he was employed by Lady Margaret as her confessor to heard her confessions and gave the Mass. And so he was a person who carried out a lot of Lady Margaret's philanthropic wishes. So he is essentially the first development officer. Now, I have a little quote I wanted to read about John, that I didn't get it wrong. This was a contemporary said this about John. He is the one man at this time who is incomparable for uprightness of life, for learning, and for the greatness of soul. Erasmus. So it's quite a recommendation. So Lady Margaret, of course, was interested in religion, and her favorite Bible verse was from Mark. And he said unto them, Go ye into the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, and he that believeth not shall be damned. And so all of the Lady Margaret professors were expected to go out and preach. And of course, at the beginning, they were all priests. And then subsequently, after Henry VIII, they've been other faiths. This is young Henry VIII. And Henry was the second son, so he wasn't scheduled to be king. His brother Arthur was the crown prince. And Henry VII had arranged for Arthur to be married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain, to make an alliance. And on their extended honeymoon over to Wales, Arthur got some kind of illness and died. And so Henry then became next in line. And the father wanted Henry to marry Catherine of Aragon because he wanted that alliance to continue. And perhaps because Henry didn't get to choose his own first wife, that became a problem. So, also another connection between Henry and John Fisher was that John Fisher was Henry's Latin tutor when he was a boy. So they were very well acquainted, they got along well, and they spoke Latin together. Now, Henry didn't have long to wait before he became king. He became king at age 18. And 2 months later, then Lady Margaret, his grandmother, died. And some think that perhaps Henry's rather arbitrary style came in part because the people who guided him the most, his father and his grandmother, were taken away quite quickly. And Lady Margaret's will is at St. John's College in Cambridge, the college that one of the colleges that she started, and that's her signature on the left side. The will is in Latin, of course. So John comes back, and he is the executor of the will. And this is a very large amount of money for that time. And of course, Henry VIII wants to keep it. But John, fortunately, they had a good relationship from over the years. And John also being known to be honest and trustworthy, that Henry did allow the money to be given for the creation of the professorship and St. John's College. So as Henry went on, he got tired of Catherine of Aragon and wanted another wife because he thought that would help him get a son. He didn't know any biology at that point. And so he tried to get an annulment from the Pope, and the Pope was being difficult. And so eventually, when it became evident that he was going to marry Anne Boleyn anyway, Catherine of Aragon's father, the King of Spain, got the Pope to give the annulment. So he did it for the benefit of his daughter, not for Henry, but he did get the annulment. So this is an artist's conception of Catherine of Aragon begging Henry not to divorce her. And then as Henry went on through all of his wives and so on, he then, one thing that he did do that was good was he started the Regius professors in England, and some think that he's following the role of the model of his grandmother. And so he started the ones at Oxford and Cambridge during his lifetime, and then other sovereigns have added more as new universities have come along. Now let's jump forward 500 years. And not surprisingly, all the participants are still dead. And this is Marcus Aurelius, the statue made during his reign, 176. It's more like our Sparti. The original here is in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, and they have a duplicate that sits out in the acid rain. This is one of the courtyards at the University College in Cambridge, at Oxford. So we can see that William of Durham's money did continue on, and there's still a university there. Lady Margaret is buried in Westminster Abbey, and in the Tudor corner. And here on the Tower Hill, we have a memorial to those who lost their lives. And a sentence here, the martyrdom of those who, for the sake of their faith, their country, or their ideals, staked their lives and lost. And we can see here the fifth name down was John Fisher, who was executed by having his head chopped off in June of 1535 when he refused to acknowledge Henry as the replacement for the Pope and leader of the church. His head was put on a pike on the London Bridge, and it stayed there until July when Sir Thomas More's head replaced it. Now, at the south end of London Bridge today, there's this giant replica of the pike on which the heads were placed to remind all the passers-by that they don't want to get cross with the sovereign. John Fisher was made a saint by the Catholic Church. But what brings us around to the current day, this is George Van Houten, and 516 years since the Lady Margaret professorship. He is the 51st Lady Margaret professor installed this year. And to kind of tie us back to Marcus Aurelius, his research area is how the Greco-Roman philosophies influenced the New Testament. Thank you.